Hello, and welcome to episode 4 of Virtues of Peace. If you are listening to the Ethics Talk podcast, this would be episode 141. So today's show is a kind of throwback show to an event organized in 2016 by the Center for International Ethics at Central Michigan University for its annual commemoration of Global Ethics Day. The title of that 2016 event was called Race, Human Rights, and the UN, and we've decided to share this earlier conversation from 2016 because it connects quite nicely to last week's show that focused on the remarks of Michael Rendner, also known as Killer Mike or Teacher Mike, who urged us to plot, plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize in response to the murder of George Floyd. And last week's show built upon an earlier show, which focused on one of the catchphrases of the Peace Through Law movement, organize the world. So in 2016, when the Center for International Ethics organized Race, Human Rights, and the UN, there was a lot of unrest in response to the killings of young black men, such as Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, and Michael Brown, to name just a few. And what's so interesting is that the parents of these victims tried to use UN human rights machinery in Geneva, Switzerland, in an attempt to seek justice. Now, the history of the development of UN human rights machinery requires long and serious study, and usually you'll only get it in law school and probably in a class called something like International Human Rights Law or maybe International Public Law. So it's really complicated, but just for our purposes, you can just take heart knowing that there's a seed from which this all springs, and this is a 1948 document that we know today as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that 1948 document sprung from even earlier seeds, such as the 1947 draft outline for an international Bill of Rights. So 1947 is really important because really it's when the international community, that is, states, and also NGOs, non-governmental organizations, were involved in a dialogue about human rights. And the very first thing that needed to be done was to name them and list them. So this conversation began in 1947. It's an incredible history. Eleanor Roosevelt was a driving force behind all of this. It's a long story. But in 1947, as the international community is beginning to have these dialogues, the NAACP is there, and they are watching. And the NAACP attempts in 1947 to, they don't just attempt, they do appeal. So they submit a document called An Appeal to the World in 1947 to the United Nations. And so at our 2016 event, we focused on that document submitted by the NAACP in 1947, this document called An Appeal to the World. And you can download that on our show resources page, Virtues of Peace. And you can also download this other document that I've mentioned, the 1947 draft outline for an international Bill of Rights. Not only is the story of UN human rights machinery complex and requiring long and serious study, but so too does the 1947 Appeal to the World. It requires hours upon hours upon hours upon hours because it is a pamphlet of, perhaps maybe 70 pages or so, but it is, a condensed legal history from the 1700s to 1947, and it requires time and study. And what you have and what follows is basically an hour-long conversation where we are focused on select passages from the appeal and talking about them some more, going deeper into these passages. This podcast, Virtues of Peace, focuses on untold stories of the Peace Through Law movement. And you may be wondering, Well, how are human rights related to peace? These are two different things. Yes, and you will hear more about the connection between human rights and international peace later in the conversation. But for now, let me just reference this 1947 draft outline for an International Bill of Rights. This is really like the original, like draft one that became the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you can, again, download that from our show resources page. But if you look at the very first principle, number one, I'm reading it, there can be no peace unless human rights and freedoms are respected. There can be no peace unless human rights and freedoms are respected. This is very clear language connecting human rights and peace. So human rights are a precondition of peace. But this clear language did not make it into the final document that we know as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And also pay attention, it says, there can be no peace unless human rights and freedoms are respected. So what does that mean? The notion of respected needs to be fleshed out. What does it mean to respect human rights and freedoms? Does that mean we are protecting them through law? What happens when a human right is violated? Do we simply recognize that a wrong occurred and apologize, or is there something more being demanded, like a prosecution? Whatever the answer is, more organization is required and perhaps the creation of new laws and possibly new courts. But realize that in 1947, we were just beginning to list what human rights existed. There was a lot of debate. It's a long story, but the NAACP was there. And so in 2016, when we had this event, and also today, we really wanted and still want our community to understand this thread. So hopefully these remarks help you to connect the dots a little bit amongst human rights, organizing, peace, and race. And hopefully the conversation that follows deepens your understanding a bit more. Realize that all of our conversations are just beginnings for you. We simply open the door, and it is for you to continue walking the path of understanding this complex story, doing further reading, following the resources on the show resources page, etc. So as I mentioned earlier, we do not focus on the entire 1947 NAACP appeal, but only on select passages. And you can find those passages on the actual handout from the 2016 event on the show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com. If you're able, it might be helpful to have them printed out, but it's not necessary. And anyway, know that they are there for your convenience. So with that, here is our 2016 conversation. Participating are myself, Dr. Hope Elizabeth May, Dr. Andrew Blom, and Dr. Sarah Mosliner, and all of us are members of the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Central Michigan University. The conversation begins with Dr. Blom clarifying the distinction between civil rights and human rights, and then we start to focus on passages from the 1947 appeal. So enjoy, thank you for listening, and we are grateful for your support and interest.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so this appeal to the world, is put forward in 1947 by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, that's a dated term, but this is a historic organization. By 1947, it's been around for about 40 years. And it is one of the oldest civil rights organizations advocating on behalf of African Americans in the United States. So, what is the connection between this advocacy for civil rights and this demand to the United Nations, to the international community, to redress violations of human rights in the United States? What's the connection between civil rights and human rights? Well, most basically, when we think about civil rights, what we're really thinking about are rights that we have as citizens of a country. So I have rights as a US citizen under the US Constitution. When we talk about human rights, we understand these as rights that we have in virtue of being human. And because all humans have a stake in how we understand these rights and have a stake in whether our common human dignity is being respected, these are rights that we share. It's a concern. Our concern with these rights is one that we share not only with our fellow citizens, but with people all around the world. So when we talk about human rights, really what we're invoking is our ties as part of an international community, a shared international community. So the NAACP understands that civil rights are actually not separate from human rights. If we go and look today at human rights documents, international documents that define what human rights are, we will find rights like protections for freedom of religion, rights to a fair trial, rights to an adequate standard of living, rights to an education. Now, many countries write these rights into their constitutions. In the United States, if we look at the US Constitution, we find protections there for the freedom of religion, for fair trial rights. So these rights aren't separate. And really, this is the way that human rights are supposed to work. The institutions that have power over us, like our governments, are supposed to guarantee our basic human rights and to work towards realizing all of our human rights over time. That is, governments have a responsibility to turn human rights into civil rights and to protect them. So when the NAACP charges the US with violating human rights, it is saying on behalf of the country's, at that time, 13 million black citizens, that the United States has failed in this responsibility. So there's also a parallel here with the kind of work that the NAACP had been doing to secure civil rights under the US Constitution for African Americans and its demand for human rights. So one way to think about that strategy is like this. We have a creed in the United States, okay? A creed that is embodied in our Constitution, that is in the traditional stories that we tell ourselves about our country, that this is a creed about how we are a country that recognizes that all people are created equal. We are a country that is governed by laws, not by people, that we are a land of opportunity. Okay? So there's this creed, this ideal. And then, of course, there's the reality. And the reality, as one of the authors of the appeal says, is that there is this huge chasm, a huge canyon, between the creed of the United States and the deeds that are done on behalf of upholding America's system of white supremacy. So the work of the NAACP within the United States as a civil rights organization has been to try to bring the country to a place where that chasm between the creed and the deed can be filled with a commitment to multiracial democracy, okay? To close that gap between what the country says it is and what the country actually is. And demands for human rights work really in much the same way. Okay? There's this ideal, this international creed of human rights that most countries, including the United States, say they want to protect, that they're committed to protecting around the world. And yet the NAACP is bringing a document, an appeal to the world, to the United Nations, before the international community, to contrast that commitment to human rights with the realities of Jim Crow in the United States in 1947. So the difference here, of course, is that the appeal to the world is seeking to hold the United States not just accountable to its own Constitution, which defenders of white supremacy had found, had long been in the habit of finding ways to ignore or twist to their own purposes, but rather is holding the United States accountable to a global community. So one last difference here is that human rights are also in many ways bigger than civil rights. When we talk in the language of human rights, we are able to talk about protecting all those areas of human life that are essential for human dignity. We're not just focused on the rights that happen to make it through our political process, that happen to be deemed worthy of protection by what's often a very flawed political process in any given country. So remember, of course, there was nobody who was not white, there were no women, there were no people who were poor, who had a vote at the time of the Constitutional Convention, right? Who had a voice at that convention. But human rights are an ideal that's meant to transcend the individual politics of various countries, and to have an expansive view of what it means to be able to live, to have the conditions to live a decent human life. And so when we look at the appeal, we find claims here that are about the protection of a decent life when it comes to access to employment, to education, to housing, to health. And so these are rights that the international community says it's committed to making sure that all people of all colors, of all nations, need to have in order to be treated as human beings with dignity. So the basic story there is, right, these are different. We think of civil rights and human rights as coming from different places, but they're very much connected together in the same kinds of struggles.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you, Andy. And so if you now could turn to the outline. And first, the outline is structured in such a way that this is the table of contents. So you see there's introduction, there's an introduction, and so the quote that we're going to talk about next is coming from the introduction. Chapter 1 is the denial of legal rights of American Negroes. Chapter 2, the legal status of Americans of Negro descent since World War I. Chapter 3, the present legal and social status of the American Negro. Chapter 4, patterns of discrimination and fundamental human rights. Chapter 5, the Charter of the United Nations and its provisions for human rights and the rights of minorities and decisions already taken under this charter. So it's 5 chapters with an introduction. And what we've done is selected from not every chapter, but certain chapters, a passage. And the concepts you just learned about human rights and civil rights. But we're going to be focused on 3 concepts for the rest of the discussion. One is the concept of democracy. Democracy. Number 2, the concept of citizenship. And number 3, the idea of enforcement. And that's really like holding a government accountable, usually through some sort of legal mechanism. The enforcement, so what Dr. Blom was talking about. Okay? So democracy, citizenship, enforcement. So first we have a quote about democracy. And could you read that quote?
Yeah, sure.
So we're under introduction, and so the quote is up here, but it's also on your handout.
So you'll notice that each of these sections was authored by a different person. The person who edited all of this together was one of the leaders in the NAACP, W.E.B. Dubois, who was one of the founding members of the NAACP and a very prominent leader in this period. And so he also writes the introduction to the appeal. So one of the quotes I just want to pull out from his introduction and think a little bit about is this claim here. So it's the first one there under introduction on your handout. The disenfranchisement of the American Negro makes the functioning of all democracy in the nation difficult. And as democracy fails to function in the leading democracy in the world, it fails in the world. So just to start digging into this claim a little bit, let's remember that America in 1947 is Jim Crow America. Okay. This is America before Brown versus Board of Education. That's 1954. This is America before the Montgomery bus boycott, before the March on Washington, before Selma. Okay, so this is Jim Crow America. Jim Crow was a system of oppression built on racial separation. It was racial apartheid. So many of these details, of course, are familiar to us from American history. But let's think about what this meant in 1947. What charges, the denial of human rights, is the NAACP bringing to the United Nations? Well, in most places in the United States in 1947, segregation was legal. Many states, states across the South, but also many cities in the North, many municipalities in the North, segregation is legal. Separate neighborhoods, separate schools, separate facilities. Most places have no prohibitions at all on discrimination in employment, in housing, in health, in banking, in any area of life. The purpose of the Jim Crow system is to exclude people of color from goods and opportunities that were promised to white Americans, that what white Americans were led to see as their right? Their belonging to them as white citizens of the United States. And this was a system that was upheld by terrible violence, racial terrorism. This was a time in America where if you were black, really if you were any person of color in the United States, you knew that if your white neighbors perceived that you didn't know your place, that they could harass you, run you out of town, beat you, kill you, all the while knowing that no police officer would arrest them, no jury would convict them. So it's this Jim Crow America that the NAACP is bringing before the eyes of the world in 1947. This is very much not the image of the world that the powers that be in America want the world to have. This is after World War II. Okay. The identity of the United States has increasingly become bound up in the idea that it is nothing like genocidal Germany and Japan, that it is a defender of democracy, that it is a champion of freedom. And so what Dubois is arguing in the introduction to the appeal is that the place where the United States most fails to be a defender of democracy and freedom is at home. So let's think a little bit more about this idea of democracy. We all know what that term means, but let's think about democracy as a system in which we work together to govern ourselves. Well, what does self-government look like in the Jim Crow United States? Well, there are a few places where black people in the United States in 1947 can even exercise their right to vote. You go to the polls, show up on election day, and you're kept away from the polls by the trickery of poll taxes, literacy tests, sneaky county clerks who change the registration days or find ways to make sure that they're just going to happen to be closed when you and all your friends show up to register to vote. And you're kept away by the ever-present threat of mob violence by whites. In 1947, in southern states, there are zero black legislators in state or federal offices. Okay. So that's part of what democracy looks like in the United States in 1947. Democracy, of course, is not just about voting. It's about being able to deliberate together about shared problems and shared goals. In a segregated America where we're not even allowed to sit together, how can we deliberate together? In segregated districts of the United States, people of different races often don't even share the same districts, share the same representation, or if they do, the politics have been rigged in such a way that those offices are always dominated by whites. So there's also a lack of accountability of government in general. That is, these are public officials, police officers who have been invested with great powers to be able to uphold American white supremacy. And are in many ways insulated from public accountability. So racism in the United States at this time is a great weapon for elites to use, not only against racial minorities, but also against whites. So when white working people in the United States are starting to make demands for human rights and employment, for a decent living wage, for decent working conditions, they can be accused of making common cause with racial minorities, for being traitors to the white race. Okay, so it becomes a very powerful tool for elites to use to try to keep everybody in line. And so this is really Du Bois's point, that democracy in the United States is not only incomplete because it excludes people of color, but also that it fails. It fails for everybody, that it's weak. And he's pointing out to the international community that this really compromises the United States' ability to serve as a world leader. The violation of human rights, he's arguing, never just stays inside a country. The denial of human rights in one place threatens the respect for those rights everywhere. So his argument is that this is a concern for the whole world, and especially when a leading advocate for human rights in the world doesn't hold itself to the standards of human rights that it's demanding of everyone else. What expectation does any other country have to hold itself to that standard? So the UN in 1947 was just created, and it's created with a bold vision. Its vision is to reaffirm the faith in human rights, to strengthen respect for human rights around the world, but also to protect future generations from what it calls the scourge of war. And Du Bois's point is not only does disrespect for human rights threaten human rights everywhere, it's also a threat to international peace. That is, oppression within a country rarely stays inside a country. He says, look, we just got out of World War II. Look at Nazi Germany. Aggression against internal minorities, Jews, Roma, gays, stay inside Nazi Germany. It translated into aggression against Germany's neighbors. And how many times have we seen this pattern, where you have internal oppression leading to conflict and civil war, which then draws in allies in what is becoming an international conflict? This was the story of the Vietnam War. It's the story, if you've been paying attention, to what's going on in Yemen right now. So in 1947, the NAACP is really seizing on the hope that is embodied in the United Nations. The hope is that, learning from the experiences of World War II, that we can make the world a different place. That countries can work together to maintain peace. That oppressed minorities in any given country can count on allies in the international community to protect their human rights. So the appeal really at bottom is this: be in solidarity with us. Help us to get our country to realize its promise as a democracy, but also to realize its role in the world.
Thank you. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which again was not yet formulated, does include the right to have a voice in your government. So this is another reason why it's important to sort of, again, it's the creed and the deed. So here is this value, democracy, participation in government. And so when you have a place that's supposed to be a champion, not really respecting it, it does compromise the whole experiment. And so we're going to now move to the next quote, which is under Chapter 1 on your handout. And this quote pertains to citizenship. So we just talked about democracy, citizenship is next, and so for that, Dr. Mosler.
And this is another really good example of what Dr. May was calling speaking truth to power. And I found it something that really prompted my thinking about citizenship. So I'll just read it here for us. It is a sad commentary on American constitutional jurisprudence, fancy way of saying law, that because of the absence of effective sanctions, there exists a pitiable chasm between doctrinal idealism of constitutional guarantees and the practical realization of constitutional protection. So to use even more clear language, the United States does not live up to the values and virtues that it espouses. And this is the NAACP speaking this truth to the world and saying, here is the list of ways in which the United States is not living up to what it had promised to be. And we need some help in making that happen. And so it got me thinking about what it means to receive what it calls constitutional protections, that citizens of a country are protected by a constitution. They are given rights. We have the very broad terms of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and then we have the more specific claims of the Bill of Rights, and the appeal goes over numerous examples of ways in which African Americans were being deprived of these rights. And so it got me to ask this question, which I don't, and I offer this sort of as something to think about, is that if citizens of a country do not have the rights that their country's constitution claims to offer them, are they in fact citizens? Is the country in fact a country? Is the Constitution valid? So I just want to put that out there as I sort of get a little deeper into this, into the idea of citizenship and how it would have been functioning in 1947 in particular. You may not know that since 1790, Naturalization Law, these are laws that govern who can become a citizen in the United States. Naturalization Law included the phrase, free white persons of good character. If you wanted to be a citizen of the United States, you had to be white. And this would remain in the law until 1952. The majority of our country's history, you had to be white in order to be a citizen. Well, Dr. Blum was just talking about black citizens. Well, where did they come from? Well, there were exceptions made for African Americans after the end of slavery that grandfathered them in and, at least in name, gave them rights and protections. And of course, those did not manifest. That in fact those rights were denied them. The same happened with Native Americans, and in fact about 20 years later Native Americans were grandfathered in and given citizenship. So there was never even, they had two opportunities to say, you know what, why do we have the word white in our naturalization law, in characterizing who can be a citizen, when we have these two groups that we've already allowed to be citizens? They didn't even take it out, right? Kept it in until 1952. So this document is written in 1947. And And it is still being upheld that to be a citizen of the United States, if you are coming from abroad, that you need to demonstrate your whiteness. There are some very famous court cases from the 1920s in which two people, one an Indian American man, and another, a Japanese American man, both wanted to become citizens. They had both been educated. One had fought in World War I and were living as American lives as you could be. They were fully assimilated, and they both had to make the argument that they were white so they could be granted citizenship. And these cases were within 3 months of each other. And they both lost. And when they lost, that was a reaffirmation of the kind of person who could become a citizen of the United States. Now, connected to that, and so we have to sort of dig in further, well, where does this concept of whiteness come from? Because in the court cases, they were using different definitions of whiteness. And the initial definition of whiteness came from the science, the racial sciences, as they were called. These were scientists who, since the late 19th century, were very eagerly working to categorize people by racial categories, which they believed had actual biological meaning. That people had racial characteristics as a way to designate which races were superior and which races were inferior. So the racial sciences was an effort to categorize people according to the lesser races and the greater races, right? So they're creating this hierarchy and trying to find biological evidence to support that. Okay? At the same time, the United States is thinking about what it means to be a citizen and instituting laws giving secondary citizenship to African Americans, even after they've been granted certain rights. Well, you have then the racial sciences that come along and say, you know what, we have evidence that demonstrates that, in fact, there are groups of people who are soon going to be extinct. This was one of the theories that was floated, that African Americans in particular were such a weak race that they would soon be extinct. And so therefore, any resources that the nation had should not be put into their welfare. Okay? So this is the ideology that's going on around these conversations about citizenship. And pardon me, I've been struggling with a cold this week, so I'll try and get this out before my voice completely gives out on me. So the racial sciences, what we know is these ideas about race that were happening in laboratories through experimentation had a direct implications on immigration law. Okay, so already starting in the 1890s, one of the first laws excluded all Chinese people because they were seen as threatening, because they were seen as inferior, and primarily because there was a lack of work and they didn't want them taking the work away. Sound familiar? Right? If you study the history of immigration in the United States, people like trot out the same issues of immigrants over and over and over again, whatever time period you're looking at. It's quite amazing. And so the racial sciences are reassuring the federal government and saying, yes, these are the groups that we do not want in our country because they represent inferior races and they are going to deplete the white races that are really the strength of our country. Okay, this was legitimate political talk. This wasn't some fringe white supremacist group that we think of today living on, some farm out west, hoarding weapons, right? This was legitimate political conversation. So then the largest immigration law in 1924. This was the Johnson-Reed Act, sponsored by two congresspeople named Johnson and Reed, severely restricted immigration. And now, not only could Chinese people not immigrate, all people of Asian descent could not immigrate. And this was a result of the two court cases happening in the 1920s. They said, you cannot get citizenship here, so please don't come to the country. We are not even going to let you in to the country. And it was saying so based on the racial sciences that said these are inferior groups. So the racial sciences in the United States are asserting their ideologies onto other countries. And for me, that raises a question, which I don't know the answer to, is how is that going to affect international relationships? If a group of scientists from one country are saying, the people in your country, because of their race, are in fact inferior, and we don't want them coming here. Okay, and our sciences tell us this. This isn't just our personal bias, but this is scientific fact. Okay, so that's a question I wanted to put out there as well. So the Johnson-Reed Act is an immigration law that is going to stay in effect for most of the 20th century until 1965. Until 1965, if you were coming from an Asian country or if you were coming from South or Central Europe, you could not be granted entrance into the United States. And you say, oh, wait, but Europe, that's where white people come from. Yes, but here's the genius of the racial sciences. Under the racial sciences, the term Caucasian, which, by the way, if you don't know the history of the word Caucasian, look it up, okay? It's a totally fake term. It means nothing. I am on one of my campaigns is to end its use forever. But they use this word Caucasian as if it was scientific. And what they did was they found that there were 30 to 40 different variations of Caucasian. So even now white people are ranking themselves, and they only want the good white people to come into the country. And if you were Greek or Polish, you were not the right kind of white person. Okay, again, law that was in place until 1965. When it finally occurred to them that post-civil rights that, hey, our immigration laws might be a little racist. We need to change them, okay? This is stuff that I teach, and I continue to find it astounding. So how long these would stay in place. So the racial sciences, right, this attempt to determine who the weaker races are, who is going to die out, who do we need to, and who are the groups that need to be protected. And one of the goals, one of the movements that came out of this was the movement called Eugenics. And Eugenics was an attempt within the American sciences to create a strong race and to protect that particular race of white people from being impacted by the lesser races. This is also why we had anti-miscegenation law, that is keeping people of different races from having sex and having children, okay? Because that would weaken the nation. Okay, so what I appreciate about Andy's contribution is he's trying to get us to think about how domestic policies impact international relations. So the domestic policy of the United States is using these racial sciences as a way to determine who the greater races are and how the United States can become a nation of greater races and keep out the lesser races. Okay, and it would become this full-blown movement called eugenics, where we're trying to create this stronger race. And I can guarantee that almost every one of you can answer this question. Who do you think is going to borrow those scientific ideas? Just say it. The Germans. Exactly. Adolf Hitler, his final solution of genocide was directly drawn from the American eugenics movement, a movement that had direct implications for US immigration law. Okay, which is, and so the fact that they're writing this document in 1947 at the end of World War II and recognizing that how all of these different pieces have come together and the relationship between international relations and internal policies. This is another example of that the way we think about race in the United States has a direct impact on the well-being of the entire world. I mean, that our countries, that the sciences, and the eugenics were not, they were considered avant-garde. There were well-respected people who were part of the eugenics movement. It was seen as something very progressive. And as I like to tell people, the one thing we have Adolf Hitler to thank is that he showed us how wrong-headed that was. And of course, upset the entire globe by creating a Second World War. So to be able to see the implications of how that racial ideologies in our country are not simply about how people treat each other. It's not about, that conservative uncle that you want to punch in the face all the time, right? It's not about these small things. It's about the ethics that a nation embodies and how that can impact things even beyond the United States. So I'm going to stop there. I'm sure I could say more, but I'll get off my little pedestal. So.
Thank you. Actually, it segues right. It segues very nicely this question of how does this domestic discrimination and not really taking citizenship seriously affect international relations? Mm-hmm. And so that's where we're going. And I highly recommend, we hope to get out of here within 30 minutes. And what I want to show you now is a 6-minute video clip of actually Michael Brown's father going to Geneva, Switzerland. And so we're now fast forwarding to 2015. And the human rights machinery has been developed. It's very complex, it's very sophisticated, it's very legal. And you have a number of different human rights treaties. So there's something called the Treaty Against Torture. And there's something called the Treaty Against Racial Discrimination. And there's another treaty, the Treaty Against Discrimination of Women. So many different, there's the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So there's 9 different core human rights treaties. And each treaty has like a committee of experts that sort of watch, they're like watchdog, and watch to see whether a country who signs on to that treaty is taking it seriously. And so what happens is you do have some people from the United States going to Geneva, which is where the human rights machinery is, and testifying in front of these panel of experts. So this is just a clip about Michael Brown's father, so Michael Brown from Ferguson, making his pilgrimage to Geneva, and it's about 6 minutes.
Far from Ferguson, Missouri, the parents of Michael Brown take their case, the police shooting of their unarmed son, all the way to the United Nations Committee in Geneva, Switzerland. They say they need justice, and the world needs to know.
It's very important for the family, making a powerful step towards justice. We need your help. That's why we're here. We need the help to get this done. That's why we're here.
Michael Brown's father there in Geneva, Switzerland. Hello, everyone. I'm Michelle Franzen in New York. Their testimony was given behind closed doors. All of this as we could find out any moment if a grand jury in Ferguson, Missouri will indict the officer who shot Michael Brown this past summer, setting off weeks of protests in that city. ABC's Ryan Smith joining us now with more on this story. Ryan, this seems a bit rare, a U.S. case like this making it all the way to a UN committee in Geneva, Switzerland. Give us the background on this.
Well, it is rare in many ways, but what they're trying to do is bring attention to their case. They've gone in front of the Committee Against Torture, which, when you look at it, is a division of the UN that deals with the prohibition worldwide by UN members against torture. So victims all over the country of torture can bring cases to this division. They look at it and they render a decision and can take action with the UN member states. So what's interesting here is it seems that an application was made, and now they were testifying in front of that UN committee to say this constituted torture. What Officer Darren Wilson did, it seems, at least to them, constituted torture, and therefore we'd like you to take action with respect to one of your member states, which would be the United States.
And this is the global call for intervention in this case that American authorities are already dealing with. What authority does the UN have?
Well, that's the interesting point here. What this committee can do is they can render what's called a decision or really a view. It can be their perspective on torture here, and sometimes they can recommend different measures. But whether they could impose dictates on the U.S. system is unlikely. It's more something that the U.S. would abide by. And the reason they're doing this is really to try to draw attention to their cause, given some of the recent developments in this case, one of which is reports that the federal investigation, the civil rights investigation, may not result in charges against Darren Wilson. Now, that has not been confirmed yet, but that's what reports have been. And so that may have led them to say, we've got to take other avenues. We're unsure what could happen on the state level with the grand jury still pending on this case. And if federal charges won't happen, maybe there is a higher authority that can at least bring about not only some sort of penalty, some sort of measure with respect to Officer Darren Wilson, but also some sort of change in what they believe is a very flawed police department there in Ferguson.
Certainly keeping a spotlight on it. Ryan, let's listen to a quick soundbite here from Brown's attorney.
You shouldn't be killed and lay in the street in the way that you did, and your murderer shouldn't go free, especially if your murderer is from law enforcement.
Now, we know that this testimony took place behind closed doors, but the organization that helped bring the Browns to Geneva, Switzerland, sort of issued a statement. What do the Browns hope to gain other than keeping the spotlight on from going all the way to the UN?
Well, they would love it if this committee would recommend the arrest of Officer Darren Wilson. Whether or not that will happen remains to be seen. And then they would also like some sort of judgment in their favor, something that says from this committee that, yes, there are violations of this particular part of the UN Convention, and therefore things need to be done. Perhaps recommendations made as to what should happen to the Ferguson Police Department, and maybe suggestions to the United States on that level. I think they're looking at it this way. Even if there isn't some sort of binding authority over the U.S., it just looks bad for you to go to the UN and make this kind of request, a U.S. citizen making this kind of request, and then the UN to say, yes, there is a problem with violence or torture of Michael Brown or others in the area. That's something the U.S. doesn't want to happen. They're hoping it adds pressure not only there, and also, make no mistake, you talk about the people who are on the grand jury, maybe they catch wind of this and maybe it adds some fuel to that fire. So we'll have to see, but in terms of having binding authority over the U.S., that's doubtful, but the influence, that public influence, could be significant.
Well, we know this shooting has had a major impact, not only in that little town of Ferguson, but also nationwide. Give us details about how this trip was organized.
Well, it was organized by the United States Human Rights Network, and that's a group that is really concerned with human rights violations here in the U.S. And so what they did was they went through, it seems, the same process that other people would go through all around the world when trying to forward this application to the UN, to say that there was a violation here, to say that there was torture of this young man, and to say that there is an ongoing torture in a sense. They made that application, it was accepted, and now you see them in Geneva. So it's a significant development. development. It's not something you often see, and I think the point here is it really has already been made no matter what the decision is, which is the fact that it got this far says a lot about how the world might view this tragedy that happened with Michael Brown.
And of course, a family in pain. We've seen the community also in pain back in Ferguson. What is the latest on the grand jury and possible testimony that's left in this? This town has been on edge waiting for this grand jury's findings.
And they've been waiting quite a long time, Michelle, and so now the thought is that a decision could come in the coming weeks. And we've also recently learned that Michael Baden, who did an autopsy here for the family members, will be testifying in this. And that's significant because what he may have to say about the way Michael Brown was killed could have a significant impact on whether or not charges are brought on Officer Darren Wilson. Now, there have been a lot of skeptics out there that have said that they're unsure that charges might be brought, but when you have a renowned figure like Michael Baden coming in that courtroom for testimony, that could make a big difference to this case and whether or not charges are filed.
Well, let's talk about how this community remains on edge, just waiting for this word. How are they preparing for this moment when the grand jury hands up their recommendation? Well,
the governor has tried to take preemptive measures by making announcements recently that the National Guard and others have been advised that there could be some discord depending on the decision and trying to get those things in place. Now, you always wonder, is that going to cause more problems because the assumption is people will be on edge depending on how this comes down. I think the thing here is everyone is on pins and needles. And the governor is just trying to make the point of we're not going to have violence this time around. But many on the ground are getting this sense of, do we have to worry about this time around? Is the sense that we will abide by the decision? But so many believe, how could there not be charges in a case like this based on what we already know? So it is a very tense time down there. And I think right now the goal is caution and just waiting to see what happens.
ABC's Ryan Smith, thank you very much for joining us.
And so I'm going to have you look at the handout. I think it's we're not going sequentially now, but it's the very last quote, I believe. So the quote that begins, the major obstacle. So the major obstacle in the way of any effective implementation of the evident intent of the drafters of the charter, the UN Charter, is Article 2, Paragraph 7, which provides, quote, nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. Even when I read, this language, Article 2, Paragraph 7, I sort of fall asleep. Okay? It's a kind of snooze. But if you penetrate the language, it's basically saying we can't interfere in the internal affairs of any country. And so going back to this discussion about 1947 in the United States, if you read the appeal, it really is a collection. It's so useful, it's so valuable because it's a collection of all of these different court decisions and instances of discrimination in various realms. But at the time, so we've been talking about citizenship, so now we're going to talk about enforcement. So if you don't know your Constitution, you should know it. Okay? And the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are considered to be the Reconstruction Amendments. These were put in place after the Civil War to basically enable freedmen to participate in government. And the 14th Amendment is extremely important because that mentions the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause. And both of them have become extremely important. But the idea is you can't sort of discriminate in the law. And this idea of due process is quite complex. But in any case, realize you have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And they are there to protect freedmen. And the Supreme Court has the opportunity to interpret those in the 1870s. And this is like, in addition to like the immigration laws, there's our own interpretation of our own Bill of Rights. And for a very long time, the Bill of Rights was only interpreted to apply against the federal government. So then states could do whatever they want, basically. This is the same problem. This is Article 2, Paragraph 7. The idea is, okay, we can't interfere, and that was the argument. The Constitution only binds the federal government. We can't interfere in the internal affairs of a state. That's the problem of enforcement, okay? And so really, I mean, it's like the 1950s is when we start to breathe more life into those clauses. And we're still today figuring out what that means. We're still today figuring out what are the constitutional rights that do penetrate into state rights, the very specific ones. That's what we're still figuring out today. Right to an abortion, for instance, that has been interpreted as, okay, within a constitutional, your constitutional right is to have an abortion under the right to privacy. Anyway, scale up this problem to the international community, right? So you had this problem domestically where the federal government did not want to interfere in the internal affairs of a state. So I think we're trying to heal from that. So this is the problem with the United Nations, and this is what is pointed out in the very last chapter. If you're to read no other chapter, like the very last chapter in The Appeal to the World is quite good. Because this question of like, how do the internal practices, the internal discriminatory practices affect international relations is brought up with the case of South Africa. And this is like discussed, the South Africa having, Nelson Mandela, apartheid. I know actually some of you probably don't know what apartheid is. I've had students ask me, what is apartheid? Okay, it's actually now a crime against humanity, but it is state-sanctioned discrimination, okay? And that was the rule in South Africa, okay? And this is coming up in the United Nations, and India like sort of makes a complaint that South Africa is discriminating against Indians, and we need to have a court sort of adjudicate this. Okay. Well, anyway, so this is where we are. So I want you to understand that the human rights issue. So you see Michael Brown's parents going to Ferguson, and so the guy said, yeah, the United Nations doesn't really have any power to sort of force the United States, but even if they don't, this looks bad. This looks bad. This is speaking truth to power. This is just like, it looks bad. And there's something powerful about that, and that again, that's speaking truth to power. So it's very much in the tradition of the appeal. And one last thing, and then we'll turn to questions and then your commitment pledge. If you just look at chapter 4, I'm not going in order now. If you look at chapter 4, this quote from Leslie Perry, there is general agreement that the fundamental human rights which the United Nations are pledged to promote for all peoples without distinction as to race include education, employment, housing, and health. And if you go to the very last line on your handout where it says economic, social, and cultural rights versus civil and political rights, I'm sorry, but this is what we've done. Again, human rights, highly technical, highly legal. A bunch of treaties, ratifications, committees, and you must penetrate the language. And what we've done, if you look at those fundamental human rights, and there's a whole chapter, that whole chapter is on the denial of education, the denial of employment, housing, and health. Those are called economic, social, and cultural rights. The right to education, the right to a decent standard of living. And the United States, still to this day, has not ratified the Human Rights Treaty on economic, social, and cultural rights. It's like the only rights that we do recognize, that we want to recognize internationally, are civil and political rights. Well, what are those? It's like, right to due process, right to petition your government. But in terms of like the rights that we need for a decent life, education, health, housing, employment, still to this day, the United States, they've signed it, they have not ratified that international convention, okay? So just be aware of that. And there's this tradition in this country of only talking about civil and political rights, and we can, and that there's a long discussion about that. So our objective for today was to have you begin to understand how what happens here has international implications, that the race issue has international implications, that there's this document, there's what's happening today with Michael Brown, and also another committee has been appealed to by the mother of Trayvon Martin and the father of Jordan Davis. So there's this connection that's being made with this international human rights machinery. And we just wanted you to be aware of that, because this is Global Ethics Day. And what's going to happen now is we're going to invite you to ask questions or make comments, but at the end of that, we have this pad, and again, maybe some of you don't have the commitment pledge, but there are extra pieces of paper, so if you don't have a pad proper, so perhaps your neighbor can give you just a piece of paper. And what we want you to do is make a commitment to yourself. We would like for you to ideally make 2 copies, one for us to have for our archives, or if you want to take a picture of yours, that's fine too. And make a commitment to yourself. And there's something very instructive happened. It's all about commitments and keeping them. And we did this last year. And I was talking with a student who was here last year at last year's Global Ethics Day. And we were talking about these commitment pledges. And she couldn't remember her commitment. She couldn't remember it. And I said, okay, I need to find them. I don't know where they are. This is the problem, okay? Like that right there. You forget your commitment, but then when you make it, where is it? Where do I find it? This is the problem with the international community. Like the Declaration of Human Rights, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, those are our commitments. If you don't know them, then what? If you don't know how to find them, then what, right? So make a pledge to remember your commitment, to know where to find it, and of course, to do it. It is the foundational principle of international law, which is considered to be, and Dr. Blum wrote his dissertation on Grotius, okay? Pacta sunt servanda, respect your agreements. So keep your commitments, keep your obligations. So think about if there's something you want to learn about, now's the time to commit to it. Or something you want to do, now's the time to commit to it, okay? So be thinking about that. But in the meantime, if anybody has any questions or comments, or either of you, there is a micro. I know you may be shy, but don't be. We're all part of the same family.
I guess I'm just curious on the topic of the discrimination in the immigration laws. Mm-hmm. Asia was out. South America and Africa were clearly out. Eastern Europe, Southern Europe was out. Who was left? Right. England?
Yes, yes. So the better races were represented by Scandinavians and mostly Northern and Western Europeans. So those were the groups who were encouraged to come, and you can see the numbers. I mean, there were of people who came, and the entire intention was to maintain the racial demographics of the United States. But yeah, I mean, it was Northern and Western Europe, because Caucasian group, the highest were the Nordics. They were considered to be, and these are all Caucasians, but among Caucasians, the Nordics and the Anglos, of course. And so anyone coming from England, from Scandinavia, from Germany was seen as, as being part of that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. And I can bring the microphone to you if you don't want to get up. Anybody? Yeah.
I was just wondering, what are your individual subtopics of research, I guess, and how do they pertain to global human rights overall?
Do you want to start?
So my current research is on the racial origins of sexual purity. And that is a topic that takes you directly to the legacy of lynching in the United States, which the appeal talked about at length as being sort of an example of citizens not just not having their rights, but being, this being a you could say state-sponsored, but also state-ignored system of torture. And the reason why it was justified was to protect the purity of white women. And so I am interested in looking at people who were doing anti-lynching work, and someone like Ida B. Wells, who had an international presence. She worked especially across the Atlantic and was trying to raise awareness because a lot of people in the United States weren't willing to listen to her and see this as a very serious problem. But also the, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So I'm trying to connect sort of the international pieces of it as well. I mean, lynching was very much, the shame of the United States. It was something that the international community was very much aware of, and that activists tried to make people aware of. And the whole justification given for it was the protection of white women's sexual purity. And so there's this connection there in terms of the value of white women's bodies, and yet the dispensability of Black bodies. And how how that discrepancy functioned and religion is my field, so primarily in terms of religious ideology. So that's my current research.
And so as Professor May mentioned earlier, my research focuses a lot on this figure in international law, Hugo Grotius, but the interest there is really in the ethics of international conflict. I'm interested in the ways that in how the ways that we think about conflict and the kinds of habits that we have in terms of how we react to conflict and conceive of conflict in terms of justice and our claims of our rights and how which rights we are going to assert and which ones we're going to be willing to negotiate around and speak to others around, how that affects whether we approach conflicts in a militaristic spirit or whether we approach them in a spirit of peace and reconciliation and understanding. And this connects a lot to the kinds of courses that I teach here, which are often focus a lot more on how we negotiate conflicts around race and gender. And I'm very interested in the ways that we can wage conflict through dialogue and listening and through nonviolent activism. And so I teach a course on the United States Civil Rights Movement. I teach a course on racism and discrimination through dialogue. So a lot of my research interests and my teaching interests really kind of revolve around conflict and approaching conflict through an attitude of peace.
And I'm interested in many things, but really, most recently, the International Organization of Women and how women internationally organized were affecting what was known as the Peace Through Law movement. And Susan B. Anthony, who you may have heard of, she was a sort of driving force in the international organizing of women. And there are these very interesting connecting threads between women internationally organized, not necessarily around suffrage, the right to vote, but around temperance, for instance, prohibition of alcohol. And so I'm very interested in reframing the women's rights movement in this country as a peace movement, as a form of nonviolent. I mean, I'm not the first one to do that, but I'm very interested in bringing out those threads so that we do understand that the right to vote was fought for with nonviolent means. And as we come upon the 100th anniversary of that in 2020, it's an important time to connect dots. So other questions or comments? Okay.
If the people in a country are like dangerous, kind of like ISIS or something, do you guys think it's good to like allow them to freely immigrate, or if it's like racist to not allow them in?
Did you guys hear the question?
Yeah, I think I got it. So, so the question is, if a country is aware that somebody who's trying to immigrate is a member of a terrorist organization like ISIS, for instance, would it be discriminatory to prevent them from immigrating? So I think the most basic answer is no. Discriminating against somebody because they demonstrably are part of a terrorist organization, I don't think would be a form of wrongful discrimination. I think that a lot of the discourse that we're hearing right now, a lot of the political discourse around immigration, pushes that concern one step further, and that I think is the very dangerous step, right? So that is, right, do we have demonstrable evidence that this individual person is a member of a terrorist organization, or are we excluding a whole class of people because we are concerned that a whole class of people somehow have ties to terrorist organizations? So then the question is, right, okay, so what is this class of people? Is it the member of a whole religion? Is it everybody from a particular country? Is it a member of a particular ethnic group or race? Then I think that if you are making immigration policy on those lines, I think that's clearly discrimination.
So the legislation that replaced the very discriminatory Johnson-Reed Act was the Hart-Celler Act that came out in 1965. And they intentionally put in anti-discriminatory language as a way to redress previous immigration law, and said that when you are making decisions about who can come into the country, you cannot make them based on race, nationality, and gender, and several other things. It's not, and I've been thinking about this myself, and I can't remember if religion was included as well, but I think the idea being that you cannot discriminate based on being part of a particular group of people. And so that was very intentional, and that is, still our current law. That is, it is in fact illegal to discriminate based on any of those factors, which is something I've been surprised has not come up, especially as there were several governors, including the governor of Michigan, who said, I'm not going to allow Syrian refugees into the country. And refugee status is a whole other thing that's different from immigration, and has a whole different process. And again, the immigration law from 1965 gave the power to the President of the United States to raise the cap on the number of people that could be allowed into the country. So I think the number started at, the United States will accept 3% of the world's refugees. You can look, I'm sometimes I misspeak on numbers, so you can double check me on that. Starting at 3%, but the executive branch always has the authority to raise that number based upon what's going on in the world. And that would happen pretty quickly because Vietnam and Cambodia would be happening, and they would raise that cap and bring in all of these people fleeing the war that was happening there. And so there's precedent for allowing refugees in, and so we have laws in place that make sure discrimination does not happen currently. Yeah.
And I just also want to add to that, then when we think of discrimination, it's pejorative, that is, we have like a negative connotation, but discrimination is discernment, and there's sort of acceptable distinction and unacceptable discrimination. So when it's irrelevant, when it's done for through bias and so forth, it's not acceptable. So that's just an important thing. I know a lot of students just hear the word discrimination, but we discriminate all the time in ways that are acceptable, such as like giving out final grades. People are treated differently if they've performed differently on a test, this kind of thing. So I just wanted to also, there's acceptable and unacceptable, and the state, the government, always has the right to discriminate if, here it comes, it's necessary to promote a compelling interest. And so what's argued here is, well, security. Security is, the compelling interest, and we have to necessarily keep dangerous people out to preserve that interest. Anyway, there's a lot to talk about with that. Any final, okay, one last, Dr. Newland will have the last comment.
Well, thanks to all three of you. It was very interesting, and I really appreciated the inspiration and passion behind the things you had to say and the way they hook together. The question that's coming up in my mind is, maybe I could focus it by talking about Article 2, Paragraph 7. Would you prefer individually or as a group that article were not there and that we could have a world government? And if we did, would that actually be better? Because, the Hunger Games and Star Wars and all those things, the universal government is always the bad guy, and the ethics is on the side of these weird people out in Idaho on some strange planet who are fighting for their rights. And do you see what I'm saying when you say, well, these states are doing these lynchings, the federal government has to come in. Now the federal government's fucking up. You have to get the Geneva or the Hague to tell them what to do. Is it always, do you see what I'm saying? There's a difference between arguing for central authority versus local injustice and just arguing for justice. And, that's what I'm concerned about a little bit in the way this all came out. Thanks.
Well, and it's reminding me of, the religious group I study the most are conservative evangelical Christians, and especially fundamentalists. And for a lot of fundamentalists, the UN is a marker of the end times, because it's part of this sort of apocalyptic vision that there will be a universal government that claims to be protecting people while in fact it's suppressing people. And so that's just an interesting piece of mythology. And I was thinking about this, especially when it comes to UN statements about women in particular, and how to negotiate cultural norms and cultural differences. And I am not, they are sort of the experts in international law, so I don't know how international law functions as a way that recognizes, sort of the cultural differences that are at play, and that when we're addressing something that appears to us as something that is attacking someone's rights, how do we, it may have a very different meaning in that culture. And so so I think, and I know those are kind of the questions I think it's great for for us to wrestle with. And that's all I'm going to say because I have nothing more to articulate. I think you can take it from there. Yeah, right. Exactly. Exactly. Right. Right, right. Your turn.
My turn.
Someone else's turn.
So yeah, I mean, this is a big and I think very hard question. I think I don't think there's I'm not worried that there's anything inherently evil about a potentially global government, but I also think we're so far from what that world would look like that it's hard to imagine, right, what to advocate for. I think that what we can do right now is, I think before we have any kind of global system like that, we need to start to cultivate an identity as ourselves global citizens. We need to create the people that this global system would be governing, or that we would be governing, right, ourselves, right? How are we going to have a global democracy, not just a global, dictatorship, right? So I think the start towards a path where we see greater enforcement, where we see greater accountability of countries towards claims towards human rights, is that if we all take steps towards understanding what those rights are, in being in solidarity with people around the world. I mean, that's what the appeal is, right? I said it's an appeal for solidarity. It's an appeal for stand with us, be with us, help us to affirm these rights. And what we know about it is that it largely falls on deaf ears, right? Some people hear it. We know about it today. It's not falling. It's not falling on our ears in a way that we can't hear. But that's our responsibility. And so I think that starting to sort of the first step towards having a global system that works better for all of us is to start living into that role and thinking of ourselves as being connected in a deep political way with people all around the world. I mean, I think that's what, I mean, if you listen to Michael Brown's parents and you listen to the lawyer, I mean, it's essentially the same call. It's like, we need your help. Right? We need you to be in solidarity with us. And we can only act upon that if we know about it, right? If we realize that, if we understand that they've gone to this international tribunal and we do something ourselves to try to be in solidarity with them. So I don't really know how to answer the big question of sort of what this set of institutions is going to look like and whether that would be a good thing or a bad thing. But I do think that that's sort of the path we have to walk towards it.
I like the way you're focusing on the idea that we have to develop gradually a sense of universal solidarity instead of just national solidarity. And since we're not there yet, it seems like that if you tried to repeal the language of Article 2, Paragraph 7, you would get more trouble from the backlash than you would gain by doing it. That's just my initial thought.
Yeah, I just want to second what Dr. Blom said, and also apart from, and they're doubtless connected, but there's the sort of international personality that has to be developed. And I don't even think we have the requisite concepts. I mean, our whole way of understanding international relations, and at a talk, Madeleine Albright said, the whole notion of sovereignty really makes no sense anymore. And we're at a really sort of new stage in terms of trying to create institutions that do give life to universal values. So there are certain universal values that seem to be really, really important, and there are there are degrees of harm. So one of the things that was a sort of aha moment was not every human rights violation is an international crime. That's the framework that we're in now. So you can violate a human right, but it's not an international crime. It's not a crime against humanity. That's the framework that we're working in. And so I think we're also sort of getting out like definitions and concepts and trying to understand how can we meaningfully talk about universal values in a way that also is faithful to a kind of creed. So it's one thing to have, and we're trying to create those institutions. So a lot of people see the International Criminal Court as really making good on the pledge to never again have genocide, okay? And that's not working very well, is it? But in any case, you know, it takes a long time. And another really important ingredient is like the remembrance of the work that's gone before, so that you're not starting ex nihilo. And we have a very bad problem with like we don't even know what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is. We're not aware of these different legal instruments. So it's this evolving ourselves and also learning about this machinery that we've inherited that's still growing very, very quickly. So with that, it's time to make a commitment. And if you could just quietly think to yourself about something that you would like to do or learn about, and write it down. And we would like a copy of it. So again, you should remember your commitments. You should either make 2 copies or take a picture. And we will do the same thing.